Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Jacob Silverman, who's a contributing writer for The New Republic and a contributing editor for The Baffler, covering tech and national security. He's the author of Terms of Service, Social Media and the Price of Constant Connection. And he often writes about the politics of tech, privacy, surveillance, and media, and is currently working on a book about cryptocurrency. His latest article at The New Republic is The Quiet Political Rise of David Sacks, Silicon Valley's Prophet of Urban Doom. And his latest article, The Baffler, is Musk of the Spheres, Elon's Doomed to Succeed Twitter Buy. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jacob Silverman.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the $44 billion Twitter deal that looked like Elon Musk was trying to get out of for the last few months has been signed, and he brought a kitchen sink into the Twitter headquarters, and now I think he's going to have to pay up to $200 million for golden parachutes to the top executives he just fired. He's borrowed $12 billion from banks and billions from his tech buddies. What's your sense of whether or not this is going to work for him, given that the assumption is that he was trying to get out of this deal, and it's probably going to affect his other businesses, in particular Tesla?
I think it very well could be. I mean, we know that obviously Elon Musk is the richest person in the world, at least on paper, but his whole business empire is highly leveraged. It's very dependent on the Tesla stock price, on being able to borrow against his shares, and also being able to liquidate some of his shares when needed. Sometimes billions of dollars worth, which can in turn affect that Tesla stock price. So he is someone with a lot of competing interests or overlapping interests, and perhaps sometimes competing. And he's not necessarily as liquid as you might think for someone who's supposedly worth $200 billion. So, it's not just an expensive toy he's picking up. It is another, it's another feather in his cap, but it's also another company that potentially could lose him a lot of money or cost him elsewhere, including with Tesla.
And he paid $54.20 a share. What's its current share value?
Let's see. I didn't check what it closed at the end of the week, but it was regularly, in the 30s and 40s after he agreed to that price. I mean, frankly, Twitter's original investors did quite well on this deal because a lot of people do think he overpaid. And, the Twitter stock price did start declining 10 or 20% or so after this deal was originally announced. And one savvy thing that Twitter actually managed to do was they kind of forced through the legal agreements they had. They basically forced Musk back to the table at the originally agreed upon price, which for a lot of people does feel like a big overpay.
So it depends upon Twitter depends upon advertising like Facebook, etc. And it does seem that he could be quite vulnerable. I mean, already General Motors have canceled their advertising. Already there's an influx of the N-word and anti-Semitism. I guess the far-right trolls are testing the waters with Twitter. But
I think so. I mean, it's important to note that no real moderation policies have been changed, but there's definitely people feeling emboldened and kind of testing the waters, like you talked about, a lot of reports of that. And I think it was also revealing that one of Musk's first public statements at the end of this week was he sent a letter to advertisers, or a public letter to advertisers, because it wasn't to users, reassuring them that, hey, this website will still be good. We still have some concerns about people's experience and things like that. No, it was sent to advertisers, telling them that this will still be a friendly place for your ads, which obviously speaks to the bottom line of the company, but it also shows where the priorities are. And that while Musk kind of does what he wants, he may find himself in the end at least a little bit beholden to advertisers or some of these other constituencies.
And of course, it's also worth noting that Twitter hasn't made any money, right?
It's been
in the red.
I think they've had some positive cash flow quarters, but it's really not a very profitable business. It's got some serious issues. I mean, we were just talking a month or two ago in the media about this whistleblower who went by the nickname Mudge, a famous security engineer, who was saying that Twitter has all these inherent problems with how it protects data and who has access to what. its relationships with some foreign governments like Saudi Arabia and India. I mean, there are a lot of concerns about this company financially, politically, even operationally, and in terms of security that are unlikely to get better right away. I mean, perhaps there's room for improvement under Musk, but if he fires all the people he's talked about firing, you could see the actual experience of the site degrade a lot. There could be more hacks. There could be more racist and abusive material like we referred to earlier, too.
Well, he already just got played by Putin, coming up with this ridiculous Putin's idea of a peace deal while he's murdering a country next door and devastating it. And then you have to ask yourself about how Musk is personally perhaps compromised because of Tesla's dependence upon China. And could the Chinese have influence over him? You mentioned just in passing how Saudi Arabia had infiltrated Twitter.
Yeah.
And that's an extraordinary story in itself, how they had a spy operating in Twitter's San Francisco headquarters. And then the FBI warned Twitter in 2016 that they had a mole. And then instead of acting on the FBI's advice, Twitter executives basically confronted this guy, and he scooted off to Saudi Arabia, where he now works for Mohammed bin Salman's personal foundation.
That's exactly right. He was actually just out of frame in that famous picture of Trump and I believe the Crown Prince touching that orb. So that's a perfect example of Twitter's political entanglements and how it's really poorly handled security issues in the past. I mean, I'm not always a big defender of the FBI, but they reasonably told them, hey, don't alert this guy to the fact that we're onto him. And they did just that. And he used his Saudi connections to get out of the country the next day. He called someone at the Saudi consulate in Los Angeles, in fact. So, Mudge, the whistleblower who spoke on Capitol Hill before Congress, he said that there was someone who was believed to be a Chinese spy on Twitter's payroll. I mean, it should be clear. Some of this stuff may have been inadvertent. The accusation that they may have hired someone related to the Modi government is, I think, considered a little more deliberate, as in they did that in order to curry favor with the Modi government. But when these tech companies, and especially ones that are social media platforms that deal with speech and privacy issues, when they have operations all over the world, that means they're dealing potentially with a lot of authoritarian or dictatorial governments. They're dealing with different kinds of laws and cultural standards. And it's been one of the huge problems from Facebook and Myanmar to Twitter and Saudi Arabia that these companies basically become the communications platforms in these foreign countries, but they're not equipped to handle that responsibility and to deal with local authorities or to protect people's rights. And in terms of Musk himself, I think you raise a good point. I mean, this guy sort of has he's like an industrialist, like in the Howard Hughes mold, probably just as eccentric in a way, but he has a wide variety of interests, of commercial interests, which are very political in some cases, and do bring him into contact or even with conflict of major powers. China is very important for Elon Musk's empire, and of course, so are anything from mineral rights in South America to the factory he wants to have in Germany. So it's hard to think that if there's an important or politically connected decision at Twitter that maybe Musk needs to sign off on, how do we know that he's not going to be sort of compromised or thinking about his various competing interests? And will Twitter be a way that he uses to curry influence overseas when he's trying to, say, set up a new Tesla factory somewhere or do a deal with a foreign government? I mean, it's just not the kind of person you can easily trust to be an impartial steward of this platform that he claims actually serves the public.
And just to follow up on the Saudi issue vis-a-vis Twitter, MBS ends up being one of the biggest shareholders in Twitter because he confiscated the fortune of Prince Alawid bin Talal, who he tortured and held. And,
that's one of those things where it's hard to know 100% for sure. I mean, Alawid bin Talal still holds himself out as one of the main owners of those shares, but we know about the crackdown that happened under MBS, and Alawid bin Talal was imprisoned in the Ritz-Carlton like a lot of other rich Saudis, and he was tortured. And then he came out a little while later, presumably after having given over some of his assets. So, I mean, he may control them in sort of a public sense, but Yeah, MBS is in charge, and MBS met with Jack Dorsey, whose views actually are very much in line with a lot of Elon Musk's views. So, and Jack Dorsey follows um, an advisor to MBS, the guy who ran the spy ring. He follows him on Twitter. So there's just a lot of these uncomfortable entanglements. And yeah, the Saudi issue I think is very big. I mean, the Saudis have Twitter's very popular in Saudi Arabia. It's one of their biggest markets outside the U.S. and certainly the biggest in the Middle East. But you have every month a Saudi Twitter user is unmasked or doxxed and then arrested for doing free speech. So, that's just one place where I think there's a lot of concern. And obviously Saudi Arabia is an important and complicated American ally. So it's not just as simple as, hey, this eccentric billionaire is promising us free speech again on the free speech platform. There's so many constituent issues that I think people, and especially people who are fans of Musk on the right, are really ignoring.
And again, I'm speaking with Jacob Silverman, who's a contributing writer for The New Republic and a contributing editor at The Baffler, covering tech and national security. He's the author of Terms of Service, Social Media and the Price of Constant Connection. And he often writes about the politics of tech, privacy, surveillance, and media, and is currently working on a book about cryptocurrency. And his latest article at The New Republic is The Quiet Political Rise of David Sacks, Silicon Valley's Prophet of Urban Doom. And his latest article at The Baffler is Musk of the Spheres, Elon's Doom to Succeed, Twitter Buy. Well, just on the surface, there's a certain absurdity, if not tragedy, the idea that the richest man in the world has taken a public company and taken it private in the name of free speech. I mean,
Absolutely.
Free speech for plutocrats, right? This is like Citizens United Supreme Court decision gone mad.
Very much so.
So let's talk a little about Musk and the PayPal mafia that you write about in your article, The New Republic, The Quiet Political Rise of David Sacks, Silicon Valley's Prophet of Urban Doom. He's a lesser-known member of the Silicon Valley mafia, David Sacks, but he was the lead funder of the recall of the liberal mayor in San Francisco, and he's created this website for podcasting called Call In, and he seems to be cultivating a kind of cadre of what you called post-left contrarians like Jimmy Dore, Glenn Greenwald, and Matt Taibbi, all of whom are huge fans of Putin's. And I mean, I find this whole thing kind of bizarre, what's going on with the far left in this country, along with the far right, in love with Putin, particularly when you think about David Sacks's whole raison d'etre, for, at least in terms of getting rid of the San Francisco DA, was this idea that California's become dystopian, or San Francisco is full of chaos and lawlessness, is what Sacks and also Thiel and others say. How do they justify the idea that they believe that, which is, by the way, a part of the Republican campaign this year, against the immigrants, and also they're railing about the increase in crime. So it's a part of that kind of mantra that's going on there. But I can't understand how you could be saying that, California's beset with crime and homelessness, at the same time support perhaps one of the biggest criminals on the planet, who runs a criminal state, a mafia state, Putin's Russia, and he's murdering the country next door. I mean, he's a mega criminal. So why are they justifying Putin on the one hand and then railing against crime on the other?
Well, I think on the Putin front, I mean, a lot of these people would say, hey, we don't support Russia, but they do, they are very critical first and foremost of the U.S. state and security establishment. And I think it comes from something that's very real, which is perhaps an exhaustion with 20 years of warfare. But then, it kind of eliminates any responsibility, I think, in the way they talk about it, at least from the Russian side. And they often will, instead of saying, hey, perhaps it's Putin's responsibility to leave Ukraine because he initiated the invasion, they'll concede some of Putin's points, like maybe he should have Crimea. But, I think a lot of that really does come first from this nationalist America first attitude that traces back to a form of isolationism that we've had in this country since the 50s, if not earlier. I mean, someone the other day compared it to the John Birch Society. And in some ways it is sort of like that. It's I mean, America first kind of nationalism where they're not opposed to military power, but especially someone like Sachs, but they see this as not really our remit. But domestically, and that's sort of, there's a little bit more, at least, coherence to that sort of thing. But domestically, what I think you see is there really is this disenchantment with the Democratic Party and this belief that Democrats have ruined cities, and that sort of the Democratic experiment has failed, but they don't really have any solutions. So that's what I see a lot in sort of the urban setting here, what we're talking about with the urban politics of places like San Francisco. They just think that, well, the Californian dream is dead because I have to go outside and see homeless people, and crime has gone up a little bit. But there's no real positive alternative or solution. I mean, even Peter Thiel at a recent speech said, maybe we need to start offering some positive solutions. But that's why I call it kind of a politics of pique or sort of anger. They are kind of subsisting on this righteous anger, saying that, Democrats are too into identity politics and look at our cities, they're a mess. But there are also, there are a lot of things that aren't really necessarily honest about that attitude. I think, for one thing, they treat homeless people themselves like criminals when, homeless people do commit crimes, but also homeless people are among the largest victims of crimes. And, there's very little thought to how do you address homelessness in terms of getting people into housing or treatment. It's more like, how can you get them out of the way and further criminalize homelessness and encampments in LA and other places. So I think that's the general attitude. It's one that, like, the urban cores need to be protected for the middle class and the upper middle class, but they don't really have any solutions for the people really suffering, which are the homeless and the working poor and people like that.
Well, you mentioned that David Sachs has a house on Billionaires Row in San Francisco, not far, I take it, from where Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, beaten with a hammer, and without holding these techno billionaires completely responsible, the reactionary right-wing techno-capitalists, the so-called PayPal mafia of Musk, Thiel, Zuckerberg, and Sachs, there's a few others too, right? Aren't they responsible in a way? Haven't they become the conduit for all this hate and division? Social media in general. I mean, it's so obvious that things have gone awry in the last decade or so. It's hard not to recognize that there's a connection between the rise of hatred and the rise of division, and largely driven by one man, I might add, Donald Trump, who they all support. All of these characters, one way or the other, support him. In fact, Thiel completely supports him, and was featured at Trump's 2016 convention, Republican convention. So there's no mystery about this. And what are they all about? What kind of a vision do they have? I mean, the idea that you want Donald Trump, who was absolutely disastrous and is dividing the country and turning Americans against each other, and we're poised for more violence, and we just got a manifestation of it with the attack on Paul Pelosi. They're playing with fire, and I don't understand what their end game is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that there's not really a long-term vision being laid out, even one that, might be something disturbing that we could argue or fight against. I mean, one thing there are a couple things. One, I think we need to pay attention to how much money is pouring into politics from this sort of group of people, and that's something that I wrote about in my article, which is that, Thiel obviously is one of the major funders of the Republican Party, has been a key funder of Trump, especially when Trump was not doing so well at some point in the 2016 campaign. And Sachs is his friend since college. They wrote together. They wrote a book together called The Diversity Myth, which is a pretty objectionable book, I would say. But, they're putting money into these races, which are mostly right-wing politicians, people like J.D. Vance or Blake Masters. They do give a lot of money to Sachs, and some of his friends do give a lot of money to DeSantis. I feel like they're sort of lining up behind DeSantis as a possible alternate, depending on what happens in 2024. But it really is sort of about rejecting the status quo. So, for example, a lot of Sachs's money in recent years, besides going to specific politicians, I mean, he gave $1 million to J.D. Vance's PAC because Peter Thiel basically brokered the deal. But his other money seems to be going into recall elections. So he helped fund the recall of Chesa Boudin, the progressive prosecutor in San Francisco. He helped fund the attempted recall of the governor, and the successful recall of part of the school board in San Francisco. And you see this happening throughout California and other parts of the country where these mechanisms are in place. You can't have recalls everywhere, but there are rich people, including rich techies, paying to just recall politicians, especially progressive prosecutors, because they don't like what they've seen so far from criminal justice reform. But again, there's no real solution put in place. And then, so what I think you end up with is what you were describing earlier, which is a tremendous amount of demonization of political enemies. Certainly, I mean, look, I don't really like how the media is demonized constantly. Yeah, we have some issues, but it, of course, has gone to a pretty disturbing point, led by Trump, but many others, who basically cast all journalists as liars and corrupt with their own agendas. And so there's very little sort of way to communicate actual truth or debate issues or settle on shared principles when people on the right are just constantly rejecting whatever's on offer, and then at the same time painting all journalists as liars and people who are deceiving you. And one other thing I'll add to sort of this heightening of public rhetoric and of inflammatory rhetoric. David Sachs wrote a lot about Chesa Boudin and talked about him on podcasts, on Megyn Kelly, on Fox News, and all these places. He called Chesa Boudin the killer DA, and basically said that people died because of him and his policies. I mean, given his role in public safety, some of those things could perhaps be debated, but obviously, just outright demonization, sort of rage-driven politics is what's going on here, I think. And
look at the demonization of Nancy Pelosi, for God's sake. On January the 6th, they were calling for her execution, and now the same guy that attacks her husband says, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" The chant in the halls of the Congress. It's all, I don't know, it's very disturbing, and I'm afraid we've run out of time. Just a quick last, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Just a quick last.
Oh, good. So I think, we're facing these people who have a lot of money. They have some ideas about their political program. I mean, I would argue that their foreign policy of just general isolationism is a little more developed. But here in the U.S., they don't seem to know what they want to do except support right-wing causes and be against the status quo. And that is not a very positive political vision going forward. I mean, Peter Thiel in a recent speech called it nihilistic negation, which is sort of how he talks. But, he at the same time is a leader of this movement and of this problem. So, I can't offer an optimistic vision of where we go from here, I'm afraid, but it's good to understand what rich people on the right are funding and kind of the ideas that they're trying to put out there.
Well, Jacob Silverman, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks a lot.
And again, I've been speaking with Jacob Silverman, who's a contributing writer for The New Republic and a contributing editor at The Baffler, covering tech and national security. He's the author of Terms of Service, Social Media and the Price of Constant Connection. He often writes about the politics of tech, privacy, surveillance, and media, and is currently working on a book about cryptocurrency. His latest article at The New Republic is The Quiet Political Rise of David Sachs, Silicon Valley's Prophet of Urban Doom. And his latest article at The Baffler is Musk of the Spheres, Elon's Doom to Succeed, Twitter Buy. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into how America was saved from Trump and how the GOP may